Hear the word of the Lord. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. You may be seated.
And the kids are dismissed at this point, so you can follow Pastor Mark out the back. It's good to be back with you all after being away last week. Family had a nice time. We drove down to Florida, spent a lot of time, all crammed into a little minivan, but we had a lot of fun together. Last week, I guess, was the first week of the reinitiation of the facial coverings there. You all look good. It's nice to be back preaching, knowing that you all might be making faces at me and looking terribly confused or angry or whatever. And I would never know. I'm just going to assume that you're all smiling away at me this morning. Hey, we're bringing to a close, sort of here, our summer series where we've been kind of taking a break from our normal pattern and taking a look at some really difficult questions that people on the outside of the church raise about Christianity. We're looking specifically at major objections that people who would not consider themselves Christians have in relation to Christianity, looking at major barriers that are erected that at least put a hindrance between people wholeheartedly giving themselves in faith to Jesus Christ and participation in the church and all that. So we're kind of bringing this to a close. Next week will actually be the last one where we'll look at the question of how can you actually trust the Bible. And today we're looking at this question today. Hasn't Christianity been the cause, or at least a major player, in so much injustice throughout history? Maybe even on into the present. And I hope you guys have been praying for me as we've been doing this series a little bit. This have been challenging series. This has been one of the harder sermon series I've done, mainly probably because I'm not used to preaching more topical oriented sermons. We usually just exposit, just go through the scriptures and whatnot. Anyway, this one in particular, for some reason, has been one of the more difficult ones to tackle. I think I went to Pastor Mark's office late Thursday. I guess it was Thursday afternoon at the end of the day, and I still don't even have a passage picked out for today. And he was really helpful in helping me to clarify some thoughts and just think through some things. But I find this particular question: hasn't the church been the source of so much, or at least a major player in so much injustice throughout the ages and on into the present? I found this particularly challenging for a couple of reasons. One, it's actually a very broad question. It's actually probably one of the most, as I read and listen as best I can, this seems to be one of the dominant questions that's coming back at the church these days, especially among the younger generations. And maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive to the questions I anticipate my daughters are going to be facing. But this seems to be one that just is quick off the tongue in the younger generations. Hasn't the church participated in so much injustice throughout the ages? Another reason it's difficult is because it's a very broad question in terms of the various things that people would love to talk about. Probably today, the things that people are most riled up about in relation to injustice in the church is more like injustice as it relates to sexual identity and people who don't have the heteronormative sexual identity, or it's in relation to women, or it's in relation to race and minority ethnic populations. And so a couple weeks ago, maybe I guess it was about a month ago now, we looked at the question of is Christianity homophobic, and we tried to talk about that honestly. We looked at a couple weeks ago the question of is Christianity the source of oppression towards women or lead to oppression of women, and we tried to deal with that as honestly as we could. So really the only issue that we have left along these lines is to talk about this business of has Christianity been the source of injustice or a player in the game of injustice as it relates to race and ethnic populations? And that's always a little bit difficult to tackle because that whole question of race and all that is super political these days. And anything that's political, we are hyper divided on, hyper polarized, hyper skeptical and questioning on everybody on the other side. And so I'm realizing here this morning that it's going to be difficult to talk about any of that without probably offending somebody. That's why you have your mask on, so I can't tell if I'm right. But so here's the thing: the question that we're specifically going after this morning, because we've looked at some other things already, and because we can't, just for time's sake, is has Christianity been the source or a player in racial injustice? And is it in any way continuing in that? And here's perhaps the third reason why this is a difficult question to ask, is that, at least from that historical end, has Christianity been a player in injustice as it relates to race? The unequivocal, unreserved, and undefended or whatever, unexcused answer is an unqualified yes. And if you're anything like me, we don't like to look at dark spots in my own life or heritage, or whatever. But it's unavoidable. It's an unreserved yes that the church, at least major segments of the church, especially in America, has been a major player in racial injustice here in the United States going throughout history. Right, all you have to do is go back to the very beginning and go back and you look at the Puritans, right? The people who so eloquently shaped so much of the theology that we hold dear. And you look at guys like Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield, right? These saints that we look to who have given such eloquent defenses to the image of God and the intrinsic worth of all people by virtue of their being created in the image of God. And yet for some reason, they found it okay to horribly, in their personal lives, to horribly oppress people and own them as slaves. I don't know why. You can call it a massive cultural blind spot. You can call it accommodation to just, whatever was going on around, whatever you want to call it. It's just a horrible sin, and they can't fathom what was going on that would lead them to do that. Or if you're someone who is of the opinion that we were founded as a Christian nation or founded on Christian principles, well, then you certainly have to deal with the question of how was it that built into the foundation of our nation, we seem to have systems and structures that, at least at that time, benefited one race or privileged one race over another. Or you come through the first half of our nation's existence and you find a major half of the church in the United States using the Bible to defend the institution of slavery. Or you come into the 20th century and you find that same half of the American church using the Bible yet again to try to robustly defend the institution of Jim Crow segregation. In the 1960s, you find whole denominations in the South starting and really launching the whole Christian school movement in response to integration. They wanted nothing to do with the integration of their public schools, and so they started all these private Christian schools where they could maintain segregation, and they did. Or you can look at some of our treasured evangelical seminaries who denied application even to Martin Luther King, such that he came over here to Crozier and studied, a little bit, had to study over here because, well, I won't name names, but some of our major evangelical institutions wouldn't allow him after he applied to them. Or you look here in Delaware County and you look in Philadelphia in the second half of the 20th century and you find conservative evangelical churches refusing to stand up for their black brothers and sisters when they were being denied loans, housing loans, or were being denied opportunity to move into certain areas in Delaware County suburbs, or were being denied equal pay or being denied fair treatment under the law, right? We can go on and on. Hopefully I don't have to actually make this case for you. Hopefully you know a little bit about our history to know that I don't have to go on and on about this or talk about some of our beloved Christian institutions who have had sketchy dealings in this area of race and the ethnic struggles that we've had, right, as a nation. So I don't want to spend too much time making that case. The answer, in some ways, the answer is very simple. There is a yes to that. Major portions of the Christian church throughout America have been participants in this. So right then the question comes back, okay, from the outsider, why in the world then would I want anything to do with that church? Or why in the world would I want anything to do with that Jesus who they all gather to worship if this is what it produces? Right? And here's where what I want to do this morning is I want to look at Romans 1. And I don't want to make defense or excuse for some of those things in the past, but what I want to do is I want to put those sins in a big picture, a big theological picture that I think Paul is making here in Romans 1. I want to present that to those on the outside who might be asking this question. But then I also want to look at Romans 1 as it may offer to us some suggestions as a church, or at least the broader church, in how we move forward in a culture that is skeptical towards us for these reasons, okay? So Romans 1, Romans is it's a loaded book, right? It's some people's favorite book, and it's loaded with all sorts of rich theological truths. And we're jumping right into it and touching on just chapter 1 here this morning. And so two things that I think would be very helpful for you in terms of getting a handle on this passage. Two bigger concepts that Paul is aiming at in this whole book. First of all, you should know that there is real significant racial tension going on in the church in Rome at this time. Okay, he's writing to the church in Rome, and Romans, to put it mildly, were distrusting or antagonistic towards Jewish individuals. So much so that Emperor Claudius, probably 15, 20 years before this book was written, actually kicked all the Jewish people out of Rome. Said, enough, I don't want you people around here, get out of here. Claudius dies, Nero comes into power, and the Jewish people are allowed to come back. And as they're coming back, they're re-entering the churches. And as they're re-entering the churches, as you might expect, there's a little bit of tension going on there. That is escalating, not just in Rome, but this is happening in all the letters you pick up that Paul is writing to the church. But in Rome in particular, you have this difficulty of people who are just naturally Romans having this sort of skepticism or eye of mistrust towards Jewish individuals. And then to sort of make matters worse, you have Jewish people coming in and claiming a certain air of superiority because they are the ones where this whole story began. Right? They're the ones that were given the law. They were the ones who were originally given the covenants right? And so they have in their minds, a certain, right or expectation to sort of, look down a little bit on these newcomers, these Gentile converts. Hey guys, look to us and we'll lead the way, and we'll tell you where things aren't going so right. And the Roman, the Gentile people, they ain't having anything to do with that. So there's some real tension here. Okay, so Paul is writing in large part to address that. Another big picture thing, or another big picture question that Paul is addressing throughout the book of Romans has to do to the character of God himself, or God's faithfulness, or his covenant steadfastness. There are these underlying questions throughout the book of Romans. Well, God, how is it exactly that, if you're doing all this great stuff among the Gentiles now, and the Gentiles are coming to faith and seemingly in bigger numbers than, the Jewish family, well, have you not been faithful to your covenants? Or even bigger for chapter 1 here, in light of what your people are experiencing in the world today, or in light of what your whole creation is going through, so much injustice that is just pervading your creation, God, are you just okay with all of this? What's the deal with this? How are you okay with this? And so in chapter 1, part of the thing that Paul is doing is he's actually saying, God is not okay with this. And the day is starting to come and will yet come when he will return as judge. And we talked about this question a few weeks ago too, right? When he returns as judge, what is he going to do? But he is going to decide in favor of the right. He is going to decide what is wrong and what is right, and he is going to decide in favor of the right, and he is going to take up the cause of the right, and he is going to deal with the problem of all that is not right, all that is wrong, all that is wicked and evil, and wreaking havoc through the creation that he still owns. And he's going to deal with those who are unrelenting participants and all that is wreaking havoc in his creation. And so part of what Romans 1 does is it tells the story of that, of the story of humanity's participation with all that is not right. Probably the big picture of it comes in verse 21, where he says, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. We're in verse 28. Since they did not see fit even to acknowledge God. This is the root problem. That the people that God has made, his creatures, his creation, they, for some reason, are choosing not to acknowledge their Creator, to not honor him, to not give thanks to him. Okay, and then as you read through the passage, what that leads to is to futile, messed up thinking, and darkened hearts. Right? As the creation charts out on its own and says, hey, we think we know better than our Creator how to go at this business of life and what it's all about, they enter into the terrain of futile thinking, just foolish thinking. And the further and further away they go from their Creator, their life giver, the darker their hearts become. There is a sickness now that is plaguing the human heart and the human mind. And then what it's doing is it's playing itself out in all sorts of behavior and activity. You get this chilling refrain a couple times in the passage where since they were rejecting God and running after other idols, idols fashioned after the creation instead of the Creator, God gave them up. He said, fine, go at it. Do it your way and see where that leads you. And so there's all sorts of things that are starting to happen. For Paul, one of the fundamental things that he sees is that the fundamental relationship in creation, this marriage relationship between a man and woman that God embedded into the whole creation story, now that's all gone awry, and people are exchanging unnatural relations, men with men, women with women. We talked about that issue a month ago or so I'm not going to go back into all of that, other than to simply say that for Paul, this is indication that the creation is out of whack. And the other thing I'm going to say about that, because it's important here, it seems like so often, anytime we are making the case against homosexual marriage, we often will go to Romans 1. So much so that if I wonder nowadays, but if I just start talking about Romans 1, people say, oh yeah, that's the anti-homosexual passage. And ironically, that's actually the very last thing that Paul wants you to do at this point. Because look at how he keeps going. It says in verse 28, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossiping, slandering. They're haters, they're insolent, haughty, boastful. They're disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless. On and on he goes. But do you see his point? His point is that all of this, not just homosexual behavior, but all of this, whether you're a slanderer or whether you're a gossiper or whether you are an envier or whether you are unfaithful to your parents, all of these things are equal evidence of a debased mind. And all of these things are equally worthy of God's judgment. That's the point. And see, part of what he's doing here is he's making this list far and long and broad so that there is nobody who can say, whew, I escaped that one. When God comes, I'm all good. Right? There's not a one who can't find some sort of participation with what's going on in this list. And that's his whole point, right? That's actually why I had us read into the first verse of chapter 2, where he says, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who would judge. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourselves. See, which is part of the problem that's going on in the church. Some people think they have moral superiority and they can judge and look down. And Paul says, okay, first of all, if we want to work on this, let's just clear the deck. All of you are participants in this fundamental sickness that is wreaking havoc not only throughout creation, but in the hearts of my people. This isn't even just an outsider problem, but this is an insider problem. This is in the church problem. So none of you in the church have any leg to stand on off of which to cast moral superiority or whatever towards another brother or sister in the church. And so here's the thing. I would say to the outsider who's looking to the church and seeing its participation in so much racial injustice and saying, well, why in the world would I want to be a part of that? I would say, okay, maybe you have a kind of a false view of what the church is. The church is not immune from the sickness that wreaks its havoc throughout God's creation. Or maybe I would say it this way, the church is not the collection of people who have somehow gotten it all together. No, the church is the group of people who know that they have a problem and are gathering together because they are convinced that Jesus is the only solution. Whether it's its atoning work to forgive their participation in not right, or it's his resurrection work, like we talked about this morning, that gives the power to change and have more of a positive impact in God's creation. Or in other words, I would say to the outsider who is questioning why in the world I would want to have anything to do with Christians, it's almost like going to an AA meeting and recognizing alcohol is a major problem and walking into the AA meeting and finding a bunch of people who struggle with alcohol and saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this organization because, look, it's a full bunch of people who struggle with alcohol. The church is in the same way. We're a bunch of people who struggle with sin. Or as we've talked about it before, we are sin addicts. Right? So to look at the church and say, well, I want nothing to do with them because they're engaged in sinful, you have a misunderstanding of what the church is. We're not the people who have rid sin from our life or have gotten it all together. We are the people who know that we have a massive sin problem. And we're coming to Jesus for forgiveness and the power to change. I hope every one of you here embraces that truth. If you're here this morning, you don't think you have a sin problem, or whatever, I don't know why you're here, because that's what we're all about here. We're all about coming to Christ as the forgiver and the one who gives resurrection power. And to the outsider, I would say, yes, the church has been participant in all that is not right, all the injustice thing that has gone on throughout history. I don't know if in any more significant way than other non-Christian groups. I think if you look around the world in the 20th century, you'll find horrible racial injustice being done, yes, maybe by the church, but by non-religious institutions, whether it's democratic nations or communist nations or fascist nations. It's not just a problem in the West. You find it in the East. You find it in the Near East. You find it in African tribes, whatever. There is this sickness. I liken it to, there used to be a nice tree that sat out here. I don't know if you remember it, on the edge of the parking lot. You can look out there right now and you see this massive shoots just coming up out of this stump. But it used to be a really pretty, I think it was a cherry tree. And some guys came to trim it a couple years ago, and they trimmed it all up, make it look nice, but they said, you know what, but we think that there's something going on in this tree, that it might not be long for this world. And sure enough, about a year later, a good windstorm came, knocked the thing over, and you went and you looked at it, and you could see that there was just this sickness, this disease that had rotted it out from the core. And sure enough, though it was the prettiest tree in the world, the darn thing just fell right over, right? And in the same way, like that's Paul's point, there is this sickness that is wreaking havoc throughout creation and in the lives of his people, and the church is not immune from that. So the question more for you is not, well, where do I find an institution or a group of people that is immune from this sin problem? The question is that you have to wrestle with is, what is the ultimate solution moving forward? And that's a whole separate question, which I hope we talk about here every single week. You know where we're coming from on that. Okay? But just quickly here, in the time that we have left, I think Romans 1 also presents a few challenges for us as a church, or the way that we can maybe, I don't know if you want to say, heal our reputation a little bit in this area. And I would say, and it basically has, in relation to two things, it's basically in relation to improving our communication. Because here's the thing, I don't think that the outside world is hearing from us that we don't have it all together, that we do have a massive sin problem, and we are utterly dependent at every which way upon Jesus to be our only solution for that. Because when I hear some of the loudest voices in Christianity that speak into the public arena, or maybe when I read social media comments, anytime the church or Christians are talking about sin, it seems, at least in the public arena, it seems to me that they're always talking about sin that is out there. It's very rare that people are talking about the sin that is indwelling them and that they are dealing with and they are struggling with. Or to put it another way, whenever I hear Christians talking about, in the public arena, mind you, not necessarily here, but in the public arena, talking about sin, it seems like we are far more concerned, to use Jesus' language, with the specks out there in people's eyes than we are the log in our own eye. Or maybe the issue is that we are convinced that the way we're going to convict the world of sin and convict them of their need for Jesus is that we just have to go out there publicly and tell them everything that they're doing wrong. And see, here's the thing. I think there is a time and a place to have those conversations. But I think there's a much more effective way to convince the world that sin is a real problem and they desperately need Jesus. And that would be by living that out ourselves. And by more publicly demonstrating a passionate concern, or as Mike prayed for, a passionate heartbrokenness about the way sin lingers in our own hearts and lives. And a more passionate plea that should Christ withdraw his grace for just one day, we are dead in the water without it. Look, at every Friday night, I look out my kitchen window and I see our parking lot packed with people who are here for NA, Narcotics Anonymous, right? Week after week, Friday night after Friday night. And I've never been to one of their meetings. I don't know what they talk about. I don't know what goes on. But just that, just me looking out the window, seeing our parking lot fill with people coming to this, it loudly communicates two things to me. One, that narcotics is a huge problem, such that these people would come in, week out, probably some people who are struggling with narcotics, maybe even people who haven't struggled with narcotics, but just know that they just week in and week out need that support. Like, it communicates to me that, narcotics is a big problem. I see that. And two, it communicates that, there must be something to this gathering together to confess and to encourage one another or whatever. And it's a powerful testimony. And I think, wouldn't it be nice If the church, without even having to speak about the culture sins out there, could find a way to model to the outside community that sin is a horrible problem that you need to take very seriously, and there is something to Jesus, his death and resurrection. And so for me, point one here, communication tactic, I would say one way we could change the perception and make it a much more healthy perception of the church is that we spend as much time, if not more time, talking about this way sin ravages our own hearts, ravages our relationships, than we did just pointing fingers out there. They'll see it if we model the passion, okay? Here's the second communication thing. There's this curious thing going on in the church or in the Christian world where I am hearing a lot of talk coming out of Christian circles about this business of systemic or structural racism. And see, here's the thing. You have, on the one hand, this is part of the reason I think Christianity is being labeled as a continuing player in the ongoing injustices that are happening in our culture. And it is this, that there is a large segment of our culture that is crying out, hey, there is still this thing called systemic structural racism happening. And what I'm hearing a lot of from the church is, nah, I don't think so. Or, nah, I don't want to really talk about that. I'm hearing major conservative evangelical institutions and denominations coming out and speaking against this idea of structural or systemic racism, or actually, and here's the thing. So I apologize if some of you here are sitting here, I don't even know what systemic structural racism is. I haven't heard any of this stuff. What in the world? My guess is, though, the majority of us have heard these terms because it's becoming very politicized, and we're a very politically aware congregation. And so whether or not you have or haven't heard, you will. Actually, the more probably popular term in today's political arena seems to be critical race theory, which I don't know if anybody understands actually what critical race theory is. You got to go talk to Dan McLean about that. That's an old legal theory. But it is becoming this synonymous term with systemic structural racism, so that in the church, if you talk about systemic racism, somebody's going to say, oh, no, that's just critical race theory. I don't want to have anything to do with that. And they shut it down real quick. And part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because, one, this is part of the reason that so many on the outside saying, hey, as you're not entertaining this conversation, you're allowing this to continue. You're a continued player in this injustice. And two, actually something that I'm very concerned about, this is starting to split churches apart. I can tell you of a couple churches in our area that have had major problems over this issue of systemic structural racism. I can tell you about one of the largest conservative evangelical denominations that is considering possibly dividing down the middle over this issue of systemic structural racism. And so it needs to be talked about, partly because, honestly, you read through Romans 1, or you read through any letter that Paul's written, or you listen to some words of Jesus, or you read, good gracious, the book of Revelation, and I don't get it. I don't get what the big problem is. So give me a minute here. I hate to go all deep in the weeds, but we have to talk about this business of systemic structural racism, again, because it plays into the perception that's out there, and it's being terribly corrosive in the church. So I'm going to give you a definition. I'm not going to give you my own. I'm going to give you a John Piper definition here. I think he's a voice who's well respected. Structural racism, he would define it this way, as the cumulative effect of racist feelings, beliefs, and practices that become embodied and expressed in this whole list of things: policies, rules, regulations, procedures, expectations, norms, assumptions, guidelines, strategies, objectives, practices, even narratives and histories and historical record. Here's what it does, which accordingly disadvantage the devalued race and privilege the valued race. And he says, implicit in this definition is the important fact that structural racism therefore may have its racist effects even if non-racist people now inhabit the institutions where the racist structures still hold sway. Okay? Does that make sense? He's saying that, look, there is this, here's what the definition means, just by definition, structural or systemic racism, is that racism has worked its way into the power structures. All the tentacles and all the branches of the power structures, everything from the way we tell our histories, everything to the way that policies and rules and guidelines are made. And the end result of this, by definition, is that it still devalues, or how does he say it there? It disadvantages the devalued race. Here's the thing. I don't understand why Christians would have any kind of issue with this. If I read Romans 1, where he says that because of the debased mind that is pervading all of humanity, now the world is full of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice, murder, strife, envy, deceit, maliciousness, all this sort of stuff. Like, why wouldn't I think it's plausible that if you take those people and you put them into positions of power and you make them policymakers, well then sure, some of that maliciousness, some of that evil, some of that pride, some of that insolence is going to work its way into the policies that they're enacting. Again, if you would look at that tree that was out there, it was actually a really nice tree, and in the spring, man, it would be beautiful. It would be, real pink as the cherry blossoms would come out on this thing. Every now and then it would have a dead branch, and you look at it and say, I wonder what's going on there. But by and large, it was a beautiful tree. And so you think, there's nothing wrong with this tree. This is a good, healthy tree. And then sure enough, one wind gust comes, the thing just falls right over. Like there's this possible temptation that we can look at this, great nation that has been built here, and we can see all these beautiful, wonderful things, and such that we would think, oh, there's no possible way there's any sort of sickness pervading any of this. But yet if I read Romans 1, or if I read the way Paul will talk about Satan and the rulers and the powers and the principalities, or if I read the book of Revelation, I read about the dragon and the beast and the serpent, the whole point is that, some of this evil and this wickedness has worked its way all the way up to the top and then filtered down through all the tentacles and the vines, so that, yes, there is this thing called systemic sin. Or again, just to quote John Piper, so you're not just throwing things at me. And I quote John Piper because, Piper is I think he's a valued voice by most people here. Some maybe not. But the other thing is about John Piper, he wouldn't consider himself an advocate of critical race theory or something. But he says this: when the Bible speaks of this present evil age and this present darkness and this world, it is reminding us that the systems and structures of the world are permeated with sin, like pride, greed, fear, and lust. And he says, in such a world, it would be inconceivable and utterly astonishing if there were no such thing as structural racism. In this world of sin and Satan and a decadent world system, it is incomprehensible that one sin would somehow be privileged to escape systemic racism. And so John Piper's looking back at that definition and asking the question, is that happening yet? He said it would be incomprehensible that it wouldn't be. And so the point is simply this: if there are voices in the outside culture saying, hey, there are still systemic racial issues going on, structural racial issues going on, at the very least, it shouldn't be the church on the grounds of Romans 1 saying, I don't think so. At the very least, it should be the church saying, well, that's certainly plausible based on my theology. Let's have a conversation about that. Look, I'm sorry, I'm going off on this, but partly because of the damage it's wreaking in the church. It's part of our culture right now that here's what we do. We look at the problems that are out there in the world, and we get our solutions, and then we radically divide and polarize along those solutions. And we have no desire to grant the other side any credibility or trustworthiness or whatever. So if you're on the right side of the political spectrum and you look at the problems in the world out there, you're looking at it's a failure of human responsibility, and it's human making stupid choices. And so what you want is the government to get out of the way and just let people live free and independently and encourage them to live responsibly. And if you're on the left side of the fence, you're looking at it and saying, that's not possible, because there's all these systemic injustices that are going in there that we need a strong government to get in and to weed out and get out of the system so that people can live responsibly. And the problem is that both sides think it's all that or nothing. And we're not willing to listen to or entertain where the other side is coming from. And you just need to understand that the Bible is thoroughly and always both. When the Bible looks at the problems that are going on in the world, absolutely, from cover to cover, it's going to talk about human responsibility and human sinful choices, and it's going to urge and command them to live more responsibly. But the Bible from cover to cover is talking about evil and sin and wickedness and pride and greed and lust that has worked its way up into the positions of power and is causing all sorts of violence and injustice on the ground level. So if you are participating in this either or, and I mean unwilling to grant the other side whatever, just know you're being thoroughly unbiblical in the process. I beg you not to do that, because I see where it's tearing churches apart. Even John Piper's own church was supposed to have a great anniversary celebration now, but they've had to cancel that because John Piper retired a few years ago, and right now the church is having all sorts of problems. Several pastors have left. The congregation is struggling on this very issue. While some people think we're not talking about systemic structural racism enough, and other people think we're talking about systemic structural relationship or whatever, too much. So I just caution you, don't play this either-or game. Don't buy into this cultural notion that we have to pick our sides, polarize, and demonize the other side. The Bible is thoroughly both on this. And again, the other bigger reason I'm asking us to be careful about this is because this is part of the reason that the outside culture is so skeptical. They're crying systemic injustice, and they're hearing from the church, I don't think so. And I don't get that. Whoa. Man, it's already 11:15. We've talked about a lot of things. You've heard a rant from me here a little bit. It's not really, I hope at the very least that you're not coming away thinking, oh, he's going all political. This has nothing to do with, I could care less about, well, that's not true. I think politics can be very corrosive in the life of the church. What I'm more concerned about is the reputation of Christ out there and to the health of the church. That's why we're going off on this. But big picture here, folks. There is a sickness that pervades his creation. We are not immune to it. And so 2 simple communication tactics that I think we could use to improve our reputation. 1, let's talk more about our own sin and our own desperate day-by-day need for God's grace through Christ. And 2, if the culture is crying out, saying there is ongoing systemic justice, hello, let's at least not be the people saying, I don't think so. Let's embrace our theology and say, that is quite plausible. Let's have an honest conversation about it. I had a whole lot of other stuff I was going to say. I do have to say this, and then we'll close it with this. I actually want to go back and restate my opening answer to has the church in America been the source of so much racial injustice? I want to restate that yes. I want to say it more yes and no. Because actually there's a very large and significant portion of the church in America that has not been the major source of so much racial injustice and actually has fought hard to work against it. And that's actually the black church. I have to say black church because they were segregated from the white church for so long, but so it's actually the black church throughout history that has fought hard for the issue of racial justice. And if you ask me, has been the agent most responsible for the change and healing in those areas in the United States. It was guys like Martin Luther King in this middle of the 20th century who wound up going to Crozer Seminary and going to other places and became armed to the teeth with the truths of the prophets and came out, resolved to fight against racial injustice, but was thoroughly committed to the sacrificial, cross-carrying, nonviolent, otherworldly way of Jesus as a way of going about that. And I think because he did that and because he led so many, I think he was a major player in saving the soul of the nation along these lines. And so actually, if you're on the outside and you're looking at the church and accusing the church of being a major player, you're actually doing the very thing that you are being critical of and that you are discounting the whole minority church, which has worked tirelessly and sacrificially and Christ-like in this fight for racial injustice. And it's interesting, if you would go and read the close of the book of Romans, Paul actually, after all this theological treatise, he'll come back to the church and he'll plead with them to be kind of like that to one another. And he'll say to them, therefore, present your bodies as living sacrifices, the way Jesus did. Don't be conformed to this world, but be changed by the renewal of your mind. And he'll go into specifics of what that looks like. And he'll say, let none of you think of yourselves more haughtily than you ought, but to consider others above yourselves, remembering that you are one with one another. And he'll go and he'll ask the church to use your gifts in service to one another. He'll ask you to rejoice with those who are rejoicing and grieve and lament with those who are suffering. And then he'll do even crazy things. And he'll say, do not return persecution with persecution, but bless those who persecute you. And he'll get really sacrificial and really weird. And you'll say, Paul, that's whatever. That can't really happen. And he'll say, actually, no, you want to solve this racial tension problem. That's exactly what you got to do. You got to be like Jesus, who did that on your behalf. So we've talked about a lot, some difficult stuff that kept me awake a little bit this week. Probably a lot of it's all, maybe some of it I've maybe confused you more than anything here, which is all to say that I would love to sit and just continue this conversation. And if there's anything that doesn't make sense or anything you disagree or anything you think I'm dead wrong with, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation, especially right after church here. Man, I might even be, or Bill, be tempted to spring for cheesesteak so we can just sit around, talk, maybe outside. We'll take the masks off and talk about it if anybody would like to. But please hear me out. The name of the ultimate goal here is to present the reputation of Christ as worthy of great honor and glory and worship. And we're the ones to carry that testimony. And so we better make sure that we do it right. We better make sure that we talk a lot about our own sinfulness and our desperate need for him. And if the culture is saying, hey, there's still ongoing sin in the systems of this world, amen. We need Jesus. And maybe through our refined testimony, the world would come to see him, to recognize him, acknowledge him, surrender to him. And then maybe, the tide will change in some really neat and powerful ways. So we pray that this morning. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.